think the first question I've got for David is, well, we as a magazine predicted recently that after what has been something of a rather lackluster period of economic growth with lots of trouble and policymakers trying all sorts of things for stimulus, are we perhaps now beginning to see some green shoots of an economic revival? And if we do, what can governments do to actually make those green shoots grow? Well, that's going to depend an awful lot on trade policy. So over to David, what do you see happening now with world trade and economic growth?
We've seen some important changes happening over the past 10, 20 years. We've seen the burgeoning growth of global value chain. We've seen e-commerce become increasingly important. We no longer think in terms so much of trading a product as trading tasks. You might think of a building where things used to be created, and in one office somebody might be designing the plans. In another office they may be actually building the components. In another they may be assembling the final product. In another office they might be marketing. Now you take all the things that were happening in that building and you spread them all around the world to wherever is the most efficient place to perform the task. And these tasks eventually come together in the products that appear on our store shelves or arrive through the post at your house. And this wasn't the case before. And this allows, or has allowed, growth. It has allowed people to build wealth faster and become more resilient. And also, as many people want to see, it helps you move up the value chain from the simpler things to the more complicated things.
Right. Well, certainly I like the idea of a supply chain of tasks, because even in manufacturing now we've seen many jobs, the factories can seem somewhat deserted, but there's an awful lot of other tasks and jobs involved in production that can also be part of a supply chain, and I guess established globally as well. And is that, and that presumably is where e-commerce comes in. That's the entry point to many of these supply chains?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't mix the two up too much. In global supply chains, you certainly need electronic infrastructure to keep everything in sync. Mm-hmm. E-commerce, though, is the phenomena where you actually sell goods without a physical presence in each and every country, which makes it easier for companies to become entrepreneurs internationally. eBay did a study of about 22 countries, and they were looking at what's now called MSMEs. You've all heard in the past of small and medium-sized enterprises. Mm-hmm. Now you have MSMEs, which is micro and small and medium-sized enterprises.
This is one person at home with a computer and a mouse and...
Could be, but yeah. The interesting thing is the micro sites sort of came in because e-commerce made it possible. Mm-hmm. It became possible to some with a fairly small scale to become part of global business. But in the survey of 22 countries, they found that for those countries that were well hooked up to global networks, those companies that were, 97% of them were exporting.
Really?
Whereas when they looked at these same smaller companies, to the extent that they were not hooked up to the network, they were exporting only somewhere between 2 and 28%. Mm-hmm. So a huge difference once you're networked. Now, global value chains is something different. It's just the ability to build something using resources where they can most efficiently be developed. But these also have an important role in making it possible for more people, more companies to become involved in manufacturing. If you want to become a manufacturer, it's one thing if you wanted to design and build a car. It means you need to know an awful lot about the electronics of the car, the physical aspects of the car, the metal of the car, many, many different things. And you have to be pretty large to master that. But with global value chains, you can decide that you want to focus on the brakes, or you want to focus on the electronics that keep the engine running at maximum efficiency. And you can become the expert at that, and by doing that, you can become part of the manufacturing process. So, in a sense, if you look at manufacturing like a highway, it builds more on-ramps, more ways to get involved.
So there is a sense that if you want to become a businessman now, or you want to set up as a trader, the point of entry is so much easier now, and almost you become global by default if you use e-commerce and you use the web.
Yeah, the number of possibilities has grown enormously.
Now those global value chains, we've seen some pretty momentous events in the world lately. We've got a new US president who's really ditched a trade deal with Asia. Brexit is looming for the UK, and that's just to name two things currently on the agenda. How might this shift things in the world? I mean, is there any way you can go on that to help us out?
Well, I don't think there's much that can be said on that at this point. We have a new American administration. They don't yet even have their top trade official approved by the Senate. So I think it's early days, and we need to see the specifics of what they would like to do without making any assumptions beforehand. Brexit was not anything that could be, in my mind, described as an anti-trade phenomena. The British government has said that they expect to be as involved in international trade as ever, and perhaps even more so, although they're going to have to reestablish their trade relationship with the members of the European Union.
Yeah. And that's going to take some, as you say, not necessarily a change in trade, but in the values of trade, but a change in maybe the terms of trade that nations do business with. And then technology itself, I mean, how is that, we've heard of e-commerce, but automation, advanced manufacturing, new materials, new opportunities, many things we see. Additive manufacturing, for instance, is another very popular subject, and how that might change the way we do business. Will that change these value chains? If you no longer need to have to import something, you can make it on demand in a country close to the customer. I mean, can you see challenges and opportunities arising for companies and countries even?
Well, certainly whenever you have change of that nature, it's disruptive. So some will lose and some will gain, and it's a question of who will be agile. It becomes very important for governments to make sure that they are educating their youth well, so they're able to take advantage of these opportunities. It's sort of hard for them, I think, because in many cases they need to make sure they're training people for jobs that don't even exist yet. But these changes are going to have profound impacts that we can't really imagine right now.
We can't imagine them, but we know they're possibly coming, which brings me to, I mean, your experience in trade policy here. Then, what is the role that policymakers, governments, and companies indeed can actually do in encouraging global trade? And that's on the assumption that we're all better off if we can trade freely and fairly with one another. So what are the roles of policymakers and politicians in this?
Well, I mean, take global value chains and what it takes to become integrated into them. You want a positive business environment. You want good infrastructure, and by infrastructure I mean not just physical roads, but also digital roads. And if you want to be able to move from your product or your ideas from one country to another, you want it to be as frictionless as possible. You want to have as few barriers as possible. One of the things that the members of the World Trade Organization have accomplished most recently is something called the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which was designed to eliminate or at least reduce a lot of the red tape that you have to get through to go across borders. And the cost of this is phenomenal. The savings that have been estimated once this agreement is fully implemented and it's just come into force are estimated somewhere between, well, first of all, 14% cost in first one is savings, totaling somewhere between $750 billion and $1 trillion worth of savings.
Where do those savings come from? I mean, could you give me some examples?
Well, when you have a boat that arrives in a harbor and it is backed up behind 5 other boats, and you have to wait 3 weeks to offload it, as opposed to 1 week, you're paying money. The clock is ticking. To the extent that you can have your shipment cleared faster, to the extent that you know what the rules are when you get there, to the extent that you can have an effective appeals procedure when things aren't working as they should, you can address a lot of these problems. We have this idea of a single window, so you don't have to take your paperwork to a dozen different places to get your imports approved. But the effects are quite phenomenal. We're estimating that once this agreement's in effect, that developing countries should be able to increase the number of products that they are able to get across borders by 20%, the number of countries they sell to by more than 30%. So this is a big change.
No, they're big numbers, and presumably, I mean, is that something that is, I wouldn't say the easiest thing for countries to do, but it should be a priority really if you're looking at developing an industrial base.
Yes, you want to get those I mean, there are some barriers that are unavoidable. You're going to have product standards, plus you want to make sure things are safe and they work together. But there's an awful lot of things that happen at the border that are that could be avoided to the extent you can. So much the better. And this is particularly important for these smaller businesses.
Does technology help there? Because we're entering an age of the Internet of Things where physical products could carry electronic tags and barcodes and paperwork can be transmitted. I mean, could technology smooth those trade flows up and lower costs even further?
They can. Although sometimes you have to get your mind around the changes, because we've been talking a lot in the WTO about e-commerce, and you run into the question, well, is it a product? Is it a good? You take this book that you talk about dropping things on your foot. You take this large book that you can drop on your foot, and you know pretty well it's a product, right?
Yep.
But then you send it electronically. Is it a product anymore? Is it a good? Is it a service?
What customs lines does it pass through? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And people are struggling with what the rules should be on these sorts of things.
Well, and presumably we're going to see more of that, aren't we, as technologies change and
we
as
are.
products change.
Well, and also this idea that a good is just this thing that you make on a shop floor. Also ignores what we've seen as we've studied the value chain, that so much of what we think of as a product includes an awful lot of services in it. Sometimes the value of what goes into a product is 50% services.
50% services into a product.
The design, I mean, your iPhone would be pretty useless, but for the know-how that's inside of it.
Yeah.
That's not the product, that's know-how.
And that's where Apple's profits come from, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remember we took one apart and said, where's the value in here and what the value chain is.
Exactly.
It's quite surprising just how much is hard manufacturing and how much is if you like, intellectual property and things like that. That brings you really to education, doesn't it? I mean, education in this is pretty important, because if you don't actually have a physical factory, the service sides of that, you're going to need quite highly educated workforce these days, aren't you, to be in manufacturing? And that presumably helps in growth of trade too.
Yeah, I mean, investment in trade is really an investment in the future, because there are going to be fewer and fewer jobs that can be accomplished without the ability to do some abstract thinking, to do truly advanced functions. The simple things will be done mechanically, and if you want to keep up, you need to have an educated and agile workforce that can move from one thing to another. You have to have really lifetime learning. You need to know sort of the basics of things, but you also need to keep training as things evolve.
So in the future, you see that, you presumably then subscribe to that future that we don't just go to school and college and train for a job and we do that job throughout the rest of our lives. We may have to go back to college and retrain, and retraining is something we do in different parts of our career as we learn more and more. And on automation itself, where do you sit with that? How do you see, I mean, people say it's going to destroy a lot of jobs, but people may remember the arrival of the personal computer in an office. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that. And people saying, well, what's going to happen to the typing pool? What's going to happen to all those people that sit there with typewriters where we have the personal computer? But looking back, it doesn't seem to be an issue. So do you see automation creating jobs as well as destroying jobs? So how do you think that's going to fit into the development of world trade?
It's going to do both. And one of the frustrations, of course, we have in trade is so many times when people talk about trade being the cause of job losses, the actual direct cause of the job losses is technology. Mm-hmm. About 80% of the job losses nowadays are because of that. But this is not a new phenomena. If you go back over a century, you have automation happening in Europe, I think in Holland, and some of the people try to deal with that by throwing their wooden shoes or sabots into the machinery, hence the term sabotage.
Yeah, is that okay?
And that didn't work very well.
No, no, nor did it during in the Industrial Revolution as well, when people tried to stop the advance of the machines.
That's right.
And yet it lifted a whole generations out of poverty, in fact.
Yeah, it's not something that we have a choice over. It's happening. It comes with human knowledge. It's a natural instinct to try to do things more efficiently. What we need to do is to continue to train our people, educate our people, so that they can benefit from it, and to make sure that those benefits are spread as widely as possible.
Okay. Well, we've got a minute or two. We've got a minute, really. Could I ask you, are there any questions from the floor that we'd like to ask David about what we've been talking about? Can I open that up? Yes? I think we have one question coming from there. Yes, sir.
Can you also comment on the impact on governments? Bill Gates made an interesting comment a bit over a month ago. You were saying, for example, if a manufacturing company replaces 10 workers with robots or a machine, we also lose 10 taxpayers at the same time. And perhaps we should be considering some form of taxation on the use of mechanics and robots.
Taxing robots, an income tax on robots.
Well, I suppose you could tax the robot, and you could even put the robot in jail if it doesn't pay. Although it might be better to train those 10 people that have lost their job to do jobs building more robots, or to do other creative things, rather than trying to continue to maintain the status quo, which is a losing proposition.
I think that would be where I would come. We do have a new generation of robots. I mean, we're used to these very solid, hard robots, but the next generation seems to be, I think cobots is the words that use. Some of them being designed to work with people and not necessarily replace people. Any other question? I think I can probably sneak one more. How are we doing? I can't see. So I think let's move on then. Mr. Sharp, thank you very much indeed. Please, interesting section.